This session is in continuation with my previous session on balance on trade. After the session, you will be able to understand the factors affecting balance of trade data, trade balance among countries, services by categories, India's trade balance between 1960 to 2021, increase in imports of goods has overshadowed the increase in export. So this aspect also we will discuss. So balance of trade is defined as difference between a country's import and export over a period of time. It is the largest component of the balance of payment of any given country. When looking at a balance of trade, it is also important to note that the debit item of a country includes foreign aid, imports and domestic spending and investment abroad. The credit item, on the other hand, includes exports and foreign spending, investment in the domestic economy. The balance of trade is one of the indicators of economy that most people do not really understand. It is really very important to note that balance of trade is measured in monetary value and also over a period of time. It can be said that the balance of trade is positive or favorable when the exports are more than the imports. This can also be referred to as trade surplus. A trade deficit is the name of the opposite when the imports are more than the exports. At certain time, the balance of trade can be divided into balance of goods and services. The trade balance is similar to the difference that exists between a nation's domestic demand and output. This can also be represented as the difference between the value of good that a country produces and the one that it purchases from abroad. However, it should be noted that this does not include money that is re-spent on the foreign stock. Besides, it does also include the cost of goods imported by a country with aim of production for the local market. At times, measuring the balance of trade can be a challenge based on the difficulty in the data recording and collection. Despite this, those who are involved in doing the measurement are required to make that all the transactions include an equal debit or credit in the account of every country. There are several factors that can have an impact on the balance of trade and should be looked at very keenly when measuring it. Cost of production is the exporting economy compared to that in the importing economy. Exchange rates is the second issue. The third factor is restriction on trade. The fourth factor is cost and availability of inputs like raw material, among others. Price of locally manufactured goods. Sixth factor is availability of sufficient foreign exchange to be used for payment for imports. Contrary to what some may think, the balance of trade usually differs across business cycles. For instance, in a country where exports are more than imports, there will be an improvement on the balance of trade during expansion of the economy. On the other hand, a country that is characterized with high domestic or import demand will experience an unfavorable balance of trade when it gets to a similar stage in the business cycle. Apart from the monetary balance of trade, there is also the physical balance of trade that is expressed in terms of the amount of raw materials. Balance of trade data is very important piece of understanding the global puzzle of international trade and thus Forex. Much like an income statement, balance of trade data clearly defines whether a trade deficit or trade surplus is in play. Why balance of trade matters? Balance of trade data shows the import and export of goods and how a country competes in a global marketplace. Balance of trade numbers can run a trade deficit, showing that a country imported more than it exported, or they can reflect a trade surplus, exporting more than was imported in a specific time period. Import and export can include physical goods and intangible services. Now let me give you an example. Luxembourg, which is a popular banking destination, has one of the highest per capita service export because its banking system is used internationally. Likewise, Middle Eastern nations have a stronger physical export due to international oil trade. Just as a negative balance of trade is a bad sign for a country's long run economic health, high export figures can equally poor for domestic trade. China, which has for a long time been a net exporter, has fought several bouts of domestic inflation as money flows into the country from all over the world. When the supply of money rises internally at pace faster than the relative increase in wages, internal consumption and demand can be temporarily stymied, causing recessions. However, all things considered, a country would much prefer to attract too much foreign export purchase than too few, as a negative balance of trade cannot be sustained forever. In addition, negative trade increases the possibility of high national debt or inflation from the central bank to maintain domestic currency levels. Making use of the data, balance of trade data is released once per month and may be revised as time passes and the number becomes clearer. Since tallying all the exports flowing out of a country and all the imports flowing in requires a substantial amount of record keeping and manpower. These reports on trade surplus or trade deficit may be revised for years following their first release. From a forex trading point of view, balance of trade statistics are best used in conjunction with balance of payment. While a net importer cannot show a positive balance of trade, it can and in many times does show a positive balance of payments. This is because net importers have to borrow from other countries to sustain their current consumption, and they routinely borrow more funds than are needed in a single time period or calendar year. Factors that can affect the balance of trade include measuring the balance of trade can be problematic because of problems with recording and collecting data. As an illustration of this problem, when official data for all world countries are added up, exports exceed imports by almost 1%, it appears the world is running a positive balance of trade with itself. This cannot be true because all transactions involve an equal credit or debit in the account of each nation. The discrepancy is widely believed to be explained by transaction intended to launder money or evade taxes, smuggling and other visibility problems. However, especially for developed countries, accuracy is likely dependent on the first is the cost of production, that includes land, labor, capital, taxes, incentives, etc. in the exporting economy vis-a-vis those in the importing economy. Another thing is the cost and availability of raw material, intermediate goods and other inputs. Besides that, exchange rate movements such as multilateral, bilateral and unilateral taxes or restrictions on trade. Non-tariff barriers such as environmental, health or safety standard. Another factor is the availability of adequate foreign exchange with which to pay for import, and definitely price of goods manufactured at home. This can be influenced by the responsiveness of supply, how to calculate bought trade. Balance shows how the countries interact with each other in the international marketplace. Trade balance is also known as net exporter. The trade balance shows if a country exports more than it imports. A positive trade balance means the country exports more than it imports. A negative trade balance shows a country imports more than it exports. Having a positive or negative trade balance is neither good nor bad. Trade balance is also part of the calculation for gross domestic product. Use the US Census Bureau to find net imports from the period from which you seek the US trade balance. The Census Bureau releases these statistics periodically on its website. On the Census Bureau website, click Balance by Partner Countries. On the left side of the screen, then select a country. For example, select Ivory Coast. Then you select the year to analyze. In this example, I had selected 2010, and in this example for January 2010, the United States had net import of $221.9 million from the Ivory Coast. Use the US Census Bureau to find net export for the period. In our example, we have taken US exports to the Ivory Coast were $24.3 million. Now what you have to do, subtract net imports from net export to determine the trade balance. In our example, $24.3 million minus $221.9 million. This yields a trade balance of negative $197.6 million, which the Census Bureau rounds to $197.5 million. The balance is negative. Why? Because net import is greater than net exports. Goods and services deficit decreases in February 2013. The nation's international trade deficit in goods and services decreased to $43.0 billion in February from $44.5 billion. This is a revised one in January, as exports increased more than imports. Goods and services export increased to $186.0 billion in February from $184.4 billion in January. This data was also the revised version. Goods were $132.2 billion in February, up from $130.8 billion in January. Services were $53.8 billion in February, up from $53.6 billion in January. So February imports were $0.1 billion, more than January imports of $228.9 billion. Goods were $192.4 billion in February, down from $192.5 billion in January. Services were $36.5 billion in February, up from $36.3 billion in January. For goods, the deficit was $60.2 billion in February, down from $61.7 billion in January. For service, the surplus was $17.3 billion in February, up from $17.2 billion in January. Goods by category, that is on census basis, the January to February increase in export of goods reflected increase in industrial supplies and material, that was $1 billion. Other goods that constituted $0.5 billion, and automotive vehicles, parts and engines, that constituted close to $0.2 billion. Decrease occurred in capital goods, that was $0.8 billion, consumer goods, that was $0.3 billion, and foods, feeds and beverages, that was $0.1 billion. The January to February decrease in import of goods reflected decrease in industrial supplies and material, that was $2.6 billion, and other goods that constituted $0.3 billion. Increases occurs in automotive vehicles, parts and engines, that was $1.1 billion, consumer goods $0.7 billion, capital goods $0.3 billion, and food, feeds and beverages, that was $0 billion. So I had taken data of US in a specific period to show you how to calculate and how to analyze the balance of trade data. In the same way, you please go on the website, select the country, select the period, and then try to analyze the balance of trade data. Either you can analyze it on annual basis, or as I have taken monthly basis, it is up to you. But it is very important exercise, and please try to do it on your own. For example, as I told you that you can take data of US monthly basis from January to February. So you can see that export of services increased, say suppose $0.2 billion, and then you will try to find out that what is the reason behind that. The increase, I will just give you one example, that the increase was mostly accounted for by increase in other transportation, which includes freight and port services and travel. Changes in other categories of service export were relatively small. Import of service that increased during this tenure, and besides that, the increase was more than accounted for by increased in other transportation, travel and passenger fares. So these are the factors which also create different changes that you should try to analyze. Changes in other category of services imports were relatively small during this period of time. Goods by geographic area, not seasonally adjusted. The good deficit, like if say suppose you are reading about the trade deficit in Canada, and you found that the goods deficit with Canada that decreased significantly from approximately $4.8 billion in January to $2.6 billion in February. Now you would like to know that what is the reason behind that. Exports were virtually unchanged, and while imports decreased. If I take the example of that time, so this was the reason. The goods deficit from China also decreased from $27 billion in January to February. So these are the examples I am giving you, that there can be different factors, there can be different reasons because of which the import decreases and sometimes the export increases. Compared to other nations, India had been recording sustained trade deficit due to low export base and high import of coal and oil for its energy needs. India is leading exporters of petroleum products, gems and jewelry, textile, engineering goods, chemicals and services. Main trading partners of India are European Union countries, United States, China and UAE. External balance on goods and services, formerly resource balance, equals export of goods and services minus import of goods and services. Previously, non-factor services were also included. Data which are current, these are in US dollar. India's trade balance for 2019 was $78.07 billion, or 22.23% decline from 2018. Compared to this, India's trade balance for 2018 was $100.38 billion, or 19.84% increase from 2017. So what will be the trade of balance in 2017? That was $83.76 billion, or 106.68% increase from 2016. So now you may be thinking that what was the trade balance in 2016? It was $40.53 billion, and that was a 16.11% decline from 2015. Over the past decade, India's export of goods have increased by 3 times. However, during the same period, the value of India's import has increased by nearly 4.2 times. The higher corresponding increase in the value of import over the export is contributing toward the increasing trade deficit. During 2013-14, there was a major spike in the volume of import of goods, wherein it increased to 28,159 billion from 16,677 billion in the previous year. After a slight increase in the next year, the value of goods imported has come down to in 2015-16 and 2016-17. During these 2 years also, the exporter has shown a corresponding increase. However, in 2017-18 and in 2018-19, the value of imports increased by 3,898 billion and 5,959 billion respectively. Correspondingly, the exports only increased by 1,125 billion and 3,668 billion respectively. Hence, in spite of higher increase in the export during 2018 and 19, the increase in import has widened the deficit gap. You can refer this particular figure and try to understand what I am trying to explain you. With the increase in the value of exports, it does appear that decreasing the import could help cover up the trade deficit. A quick look at the different commodities being imported would reveal that petroleum products, machinery, organic and inorganic chemical from a major part of the world import. These commodities have a significant impact on the economy as they are vital to commercial activity of the country. While alternate solutions can be sought out, a decrease in the import in the short term might not be a plausible solution. On the other hand, increasing export, more specifically the value of the services where India has a surplus, can help to cut down on the deficit. The balance of trade data records the value of merchandise trade of India with its trading partners. Merchandise trade is a key indicator of the development of the economy. India's largest trade partners include US, European Union and China. India has maintained an overall trade deficit since 1990, and in the past decade, the deficit has increased manifold. According to the World Trade Organization, India's share export of merchandise goods in 2015 was 1.5%. In spite of COVID-19 pandemic, a 2-month-long nationwide lockdown and a large GDP contractions in 2020, foreign capital flows to India remain surprisingly resilient. Data from IMF's balance of payment statistics for the calendar year 2020 reveals that India received about $80 billion in foreign direct investment, and foreign portfolio investment inflows ranking behind China, but higher than Russia, Brazil and South Africa put together. As a percentage of gross domestic product, India's inflow amounted to about 3%, while China and Brazil received 3.2 and 2.2% respectively. On the other hand, Russia and South Africa had capital outflows. It appears that India's demographies, its large market, a working democracy and a favorable economic outlook over the longer term are likely key factors that have led foreign investors to invest in India during this period.